gentlemen, guten Morgen. It's a genuine pleasure and a privilege to be back in Berlin for this energy transition dialogue. Although it might actually surprise you to hear that my key message at this dialogue is the time for talking is over. It's time for action. We're facing a climate crisis that poses an existential threat to all humanity. The evidence about the effects of climate change is incontrovertible, and the moral case for urgent action is indisputable. Many of us in this room have been talking about climate for decades. The elders, brought together by Nelson Mandela in 2007, of whom I'm now the chair following the very sad death last August of Kofi Annan, view climate change alongside nuclear weapons as the twin existential threats of our age. But we need to be blunt. Words are not enough. What we need is action. Action to drastically cut emissions so temperatures don't rise above the 1.5 degree limit. Action to end the use of fossil fuels in domestic markets and the financing of fossil fuel projects in developing countries by development banks and other financial institutions. And action to deliver a just transition so that regions and communities previously reliant on fossil fuel production for jobs and broader economic and social structures are not abandoned, that workers' rights and dignity are respected, and that new opportunities are provided through investment and education for current and future generations. I'm conscious, of course, that the word transition has an especial resonance here in Berlin in 2019. 30 years ago, this city and this whole country was on the brink of momentous change that became known as Die Wende. As mass popular protests in the German Democratic Republic forced what had been unthinkable for decades, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the communist regime, and ultimately the reunification of East and West Germany. Germans can be rightly proud of today's thriving democratic culture and the leadership the country has played on international climate policy and in welcoming hundreds of thousands of refugees and migrants in recent years. But it must also be acknowledged that the fruits of this transition weren't always evenly distributed, leading in some cases to bitterness and alienation. In too many cases, short-term financial calculations drove investment policy, while former industrial workers and state employees were left with few viable employment options in their home cities and regions. So we must meet the imperative to deliver an energy transition that leads to a zero-carbon, climate-resilient economy, and we must learn from both the successes and the challenges of Germany's recent past to make sure the model we choose is sustainable, just, inclusive, and robust. In order to do this, we need to radically shift our assumptions and expectations about what drives economic and development policy, where the political consensus should lie, and what responsibilities political and business leaders owe to their respective constituencies. A week ago, I led a group of elders to China, where we discussed the reality that some countries have been reneging or faltering on their Paris climate commitments. In that context, we, the elders, urged China to consider showing more leadership and ambition, even though China is still in some ways a developing country. So how much more do the elders expect from a leading European country? Yes. To quote the great post-war German politician Willy Brandt, the future will not be shaped by those who remain stuck in the past. That quote is from a speech he delivered in 1971, nearly half a century ago. But his words will ring true today, at a time when our world and our climate are changing with disorientating speed. We need, I believe, a climate justice movement, speaking up for people who have the least capacity to protect themselves, their families, their homes, and their incomes from the impacts of climate change, and indeed climate action policies which aren't grounded in human rights. Just think of the terrible devastation caused by Cyclone Idai in recent weeks in some of the poorest countries in Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. I've just come from Abidjan, where I was taking part in the Mo Ibrahim Forum, an annual forum on African leadership. We were talking about migration, jobs and youth, but we were talking a lot about that devastating cyclone, about the intense drought still in East Africa, about the problems that African countries are suffering from. And I was particularly struck by a fellow elder who was there, Graça Michel. Graça, as you know, is from Mozambique. She had been to Beira. She had seen the devastation. And she actually said to me, you know, Mary, I really didn't quite see the connection you were making between climate and human rights and your climate justice until I saw that devastation. It is not acceptable that this is happening and that it is caused by human activities continuing with fossil fuels. You know, a very deeply felt message from my fellow elder. And in this case, climate change is not only a destructive force in its own right, it also serves to amplify and aggravate existing inequalities, as those with the least resources suffer the greatest hardships. Climate change respects no borders, and it affects all countries, regardless of income level, as witnessed by the devastating floods here in Germany in recent years, or the cyclones and hurricanes that have battered the coasts of the United States. At its heart, climate justice is a transformative concept. It insists on a shift from a discourse on greenhouse gases and melting ice caps into what in effect is a civil rights movement with people and communities most vulnerable to climate impacts at its heart. Now, thanks to the recent marches, strikes and protests of hundreds of thousands of school children, including, I know, here in Berlin, we've begun to understand the intergenerational injustice of climate change and the need to plan transition policy over a time span to include many generations to follow, including those yet unborn. The report last October of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on the steps needed to meet the target of keeping warming to 1.5 degrees should and must herald the planned end of the fossil fuel era. We've entered a new reality where fossil fuel companies have lost their legitimacy and social license to operate, but it must be a planned transition. If governments are to retain their own legitimacy and trust among citizens, this means they must end all fossil fuel subsidies in all forms. So coal and other hydrocarbons are kept in the ground and resources are invested instead in clean, renewable energy and green technologies. And these are hardly outrageous demands for a country like Germany. It's merely a reminder to the government here to live up to its own commitment as a G20 member to end all fossil fuel subsidies a decade after the promise was first made. As you will know better than me, there are some 83 billion tonnes of hard coal still in the ground in Germany. Of these, 36 million tonnes are considered mineable. But their extremely deep and complicated geological location makes mining too costly to compete on the world market. It therefore makes neither economic nor environmental sense to persist in fossil fuel extraction. In every sense, it's a waste of resources. I know that a huge consultation exercise has been undertaken in this country in recent months as part of the Coal Exit Commission, and that an agreement has been reached to end coal-fired power generation by 2038. This report acknowledges that ending coal-fired power production around the globe is indispensable for effective climate action. And this needs to be retained as the key message by all stakeholders, from government and industry to NGOs, civil society, labour unions and policy experts. Germany has shown the world that high levels of renewable energy are affordable, reliable and manageable. The next step is a just transition out of coal for good, which can show other countries that such a process is economically, socially and politically viable. Analysis by the International Energy Agency, and I understand you heard at the highest level from the IEA this morning, and climate analytics shows that OECD countries need to be off coal by 2030. Germany, as the world's fifth biggest user of coal and the biggest user of lignite, has a special responsibility to act. So the recommendations of the Coal Exit Commission are a welcome first step. But I do urge you all to show greater ambition and urgency, infused with a spirit of solidarity. This is no time for incremental steps. We need radical action that sends a signal to investors, energy companies and other governments that business as usual is not an option. Financial support to help a just transition for the affected communities in coal regions is only fair, but it would be a poor signal and a questionable use of public funds if Germany spends billions in compensation to power utilities, which have spent too long resisting action on climate change, instead of to the people and communities affected. I've seen in my own work with the B team of business leaders, which has a close link with the elders, and they have committed their companies to have net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and to do it the climate justice way. I've seen that the private sector can be a positive force in helping achieve climate justice with just transition. But business leaders must also speak up for a regulatory environment that protects all human rights, one that holds them accountable for their actions as well. They must also do more to be transparent and accountable about their own activities, including their roles in partnerships to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. Germany and other developed countries need to accelerate their plans for a post-coal, carbon-neutral future. But they cannot simply insist that poorer countries refrain from using fuels on account of climate change. Instead, they must provide feasible alternatives. In the spirit of global solidarity and self-interest, all countries need to work together to enable an inclusive transition, one which prioritises the needs of those furthest behind and ensures all people benefit from the technologies developed to pioneer sustainable development pathways. Indeed, developed countries should learn from the initiatives like the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which I've worked closely with, where small island states and other poor countries acutely at risk from rising temperatures and sea levels have shown that bold and inclusive leadership is possible. I attended a ministerial before the meeting in Bonn chaired by Fiji, the COP, a couple of years ago, and it was held in Addis under the chairmanship of Ethiopia. And I was so impressed by the ambition of those presidents and prime ministers and ministers of small island states and least developed countries to have that radical transition. But they need the investment, they need the transfer of technology. And just as critically, development banks and export finance initiatives from the rich industrialized countries must immediately halt investment in fossil fuel projects abroad. Otherwise, developing countries will understandably resent what they see as hypocrisy and even maybe neo-colonial attitudes, with rich countries effectively exporting their carbon emissions and leaving those with fewer resources to count the cost in economic and environmental terms. I have to say that in the context of being in Abidjan and talking about migration, jobs and youth, there was a lot of talk about the need for more support for African countries to move more rapidly into clean energy, both large projects but also off-grid energy. And I don't know why we can't have a moonshot approach to getting to the approximately 1 billion people who never switched the switch for electricity and 2.3 billion who still cook on dirty cook stoves. When we have the gadgets, we have all the possibilities. Why don't we make that a real moonshot goal for our world in order to show the better world that we can achieve? Sometimes it may be a useful advocacy tool to present these choices as a matter of sound investment or shrewd self-interest, but fundamentally it's a matter of human rights and of justice. Earlier I quoted Willy Brandt, but I'm also reminded of another remark from a century ago by someone on the more radical end of the German political spectrum, Rosa Luxemburg. She said that freedom is always freedom for the one who thinks differently. Her words are an inspiration and a challenge. Freedom means diversity, a relentless questioning, a refusal to accept orthodoxies and dogmas from any political movement. But freedom also means responsibility for all citizens to engage in the public sphere and democratic process, not withdraw into apathy or virtual echo chambers of the like-minded. This means engaging with the fossil fuel companies and financial institutions and trying to build a constructive dialogue while never compromising on the principle and the urgency of action. It means listening to the former coal and steel workers and their families in regions across Germany, from Lusatia to the Ruhr, understanding their own perceptions and ensuring that economic and social transitions are people-centred, inclusive, and designed with social justice in mind. The existential threat of climate change confronts us with our shared interdependence. I believe, as a granny, I'm lucky enough to have 6 grandchildren, the eldest is 15, so I've been listening with increasing awareness of our role of global citizens to the school children. They will come out again en masse on the 12th of April. Let's just watch how many here in Germany, in other countries in Europe, in Australia, in the United States, in various parts of the world. They are saying to us, you are not protecting us. You are not protecting our future. What could be more important? So I do look forward to stimulating discussions. And I wanted to end with the importance of culture in this debate by just simply lifting this up and hoping that a number of you recognize the little son of my friend Oliver Eliasson. Oliver has his wonderful studio here in Berlin. I've been there a number of times. He brought this little son to Paris to encourage solar energy off-grid for developing countries. And he's as passionate about the climate issue as I am. And we've talked about how to imagine the world that we will have, a healthier world, a world with no air pollution when we have moved, and a world where hopefully everybody will have the energy to make sure that their families can be safe and prosper, and that children can be educated at school. And so there are 3 things that we all need to do. One is everybody needs to take climate change personally in their lives, every single one of us. I've become a pescatarian. I don't eat meat, sorry. And, you know, it's a small thing, but I did like lamb very much from the west of Ireland, no more. And I'm saying I've done something. When you've done something yourself that you wouldn't otherwise have done because you really care about this issue, then get cross and angry about those with power who are not doing enough. And that means governments at different levels. That means business, particularly fossil fuel. It means agriculture, it means transport, it means everything. Use your voice, use your vote. If necessary, go out and march. Do what the school children are doing. Make your voice heard. And then the 3rd thing, and this is the sun, imagine this world that we need to be hurrying towards so that we will be energized to hurry towards it as quickly as possible. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.